I took in a hungry, adorable alien woman who collapsed at my doorstep. Now she calls me family. Some people die in silence. Others arrive with a storm. On Kestra 6, storms didn't whisper. They screamed. The cold here didn't simply chill you. It reached into your marrow and hollowed you out. A dry, sharp cold that cracked metal, burned exposed skin, and made even synthetic materials brittle over time. Nothing survived long on the surface. Nothing except regret, and maybe stew. Inside a weather-worn habitation dome buried halfway in snowdrift, maintenance technician Stuart Halden, Stu to the few who had once known him, sat alone, as he had every morning for nearly 3 years. No calendar hung on the wall. No daily log was marked. The only way he knew the days were passing was because his food rations kept shrinking, and the frost on the eastern window thickened a little more each morning. He moved in silence, unhurried, heating a ration of synth eggs on a rusting thermal plate. The taste was always the same, dry, flavorless, forgettable, like the world around him. He scooped a spoonful into his mouth and chewed slowly, staring blankly at the layers of ice creeping down the inside of the dome's reinforced glass. 3 years of silence. 3 years of choosing not to feel, and all of it by design. Kestra 6 had been a thriving research outpost once, but seismic instability, unpredictable ice fractures, and supply chain cuts had made it obsolete. Only a few domes remained active, automated mostly, or manned by personnel like Stu, people they could afford to forget, people like him. They called it a voluntary reassignment. What they meant was, you're no longer useful anywhere else. He'd accepted the post without hesitation, no questions, no bargaining, just a quiet yes. Because after her, after everything, what was left to bargain for? The storm had started the night before. He'd heard it building like a living thing, howling through the distant canyons and slamming against the dome with gusts strong enough to shake the walls. The generator had groaned under the strain. He'd reinforced the airlocks, double-checked the outer clamps, then sat by the heater and listened to the storm scream itself hoarse outside. The noise didn't bother him. He liked it even. It matched something in him. Around 0400, the outer motion sensor pinged. He ignored it. Wind-blown snow often triggered the sensors. Chunks of falling ice, faulty wiring, even temperature shifts. Nothing new, nothing worth rising for. It pinged again 20 minutes later, this time longer, a sustained signal. Still, he didn't move. His legs were warm under the blanket, his eyes heavy. If the dome was going to collapse, it would have done it already. But when it pinged a third time, short, rapid, and followed by a system tremble, he frowned. He set down his mug, stood slowly, bones creaking in protest. The storm was still raging outside, the wind an unbroken wall of white noise, but something in that last ping, it was different. He didn't believe in premonitions, but his gut had kept him alive more times than protocol. He suited up, pulling on his insulated gear with practiced hands. The cold met him the second he opened the outer hatch, sharp, fast, and punishing. Visibility was close to zero. The world outside reduced to swirling whiteness and muted blue shadows. The snow had piled up high near the entry ramp. The wind had partially buried the landing markers. He stepped carefully, each movement deliberate. The source of the signal was just beyond the southern arc of the dome, right where the outer service line bent near the buried generator intake. He turned the corner, expecting to find a collapsed antenna or maybe a broken relay box. He froze. Something dark broke the monotony of white. No, someone, half buried in snowdrift, lying still, one arm barely visible, fingers curled in a claw-like shape. A figure, humanoid in shape but clearly not human. Stu's heart stopped for a moment. Then he was moving faster than he had in months, kneeling beside her, brushing snow from her face with shaking hands. She was alive, barely, skin like moonlight-tinted ice, a faint blue sheen that glowed subtly under the dome's emergency lights. Long, tangled white hair streaked across her face, matted with frost. Her features were sharp, angular, with a symmetry that was both alien and hauntingly beautiful. Ridge patterns curled along her temples, down the sides of her neck, natural, not tattooed. Her lips were cracked, blue at the edges. Her breathing was shallow, slower than human. Her clothing, if it had ever been complete, was torn and inadequate. It looked salvaged, pieced together from layers of incompatible materials. A thermal wrap hung half loose around her shoulders, its heating filament long dead. She looked like she'd been wandering the wastes for days, and somehow, she'd ended up here. Stu didn't stop to ask how. He didn't question it. He slipped off his coat, wrapped it around her gently, and lifted her from the snow. Her body was ice cold, frighteningly light. She didn't resist. Her head lolled forward, breath rattling through her chest in weak gasps. As he turned to carry her back toward the dome, her hand twitched, just barely, then closed, fingers curling tightly into the collar of his coat. A reflex, or instinct, or maybe something else entirely. He looked down. Her eyes fluttered open for the briefest second, golden, wide, not focused, but in them was a flicker of something human. Then she passed out. He didn't let go. Inside the dome felt like another world. The warmth hit like a wave, turning frost to vapor on their suits. He laid her gently beside the thermal vent, adjusting the heat flow to maximum. Steam curled from her skin. He stripped the remnants of her wrap away, carefully, respectfully, and wrapped her in an insulated blanket, then added his emergency one on top. She didn't stir. He crouched beside her for a long moment, watching her breath, counting it. She was here, real, flesh and blood, and utterly alien. What was she doing on Kestra 6? There were no active landing ports within 500 clicks, no settlements, no ships logged in orbit. And why now, during the worst storm cycle of the year? He reached for the comms panel instinctively. Protocol demanded immediate contact with Central Command for first contact events, but his hand hovered. They would take her, quarantine her, dissect her. They wouldn't see a person, just an anomaly. He shut the panel off. No reports, no alerts, not yet. That night he sat awake as she slept. Occasionally she stirred, murmuring faint words in a language he didn't understand. Once she whispered something soft, over and over, barely audible. It sounded like a name, or a plea. He didn't recognize the word, but the emotion behind it, that, he understood. In the silence, in the fragile warmth of the dome's fading heat, Stu realized something strange. For the first time in years, he felt not alone. He didn't know her name, didn't know what she was, didn't know why she had come, but she was here. And that changed everything. She woke with a sound. It wasn't loud, just a soft intake of breath, but Stu heard it instantly. He'd been sitting in the corner of the dome, barely blinking, watching her, waiting. She shifted under the blankets, her fingers twitching slightly before she pushed herself upright in a shaky, uncertain motion. Her eyes opened slowly, adjusting to the filtered light of the dome's interior. They were amber, bright, luminous even in exhaustion, and filled with something primal. Not confusion, not fear, need. Her gaze snapped toward him, sharp and focused now, and Stu instinctively raised both hands a little, palms up. "Hey," he said quietly, trying not to startle her. "It's okay. You're safe here." She didn't react to the words, but she didn't flinch either. Her eyes scanned the room, darting across the walls, the floor, the vents, then locked onto the emergency rations stacked on the shelf behind him. And that's when he understood. She was starving. Her body trembled with the effort of staying upright, but she was already moving, pushing the blanket off her shoulders, unsteady legs carrying her forward with the grace of someone who used to be strong once. Her hands reached out toward the rations like she didn't even see him anymore. Just the food. Stu moved quickly, not to stop her, but to help. He grabbed the nearest heat pack meal and tore it open, steam rising from the compact container. It wasn't much, just protein paste with some minerals and synthetic starch. But to someone half frozen and empty, it might as well have been a feast. He held it out to her with both hands. She hesitated, watching his face for the briefest moment. Then, with the desperation of someone who had gone too long without anything real, she took it and dropped to the floor. She didn't speak. She didn't thank him. She ate. Stu didn't interrupt. He sat beside her but kept a respectful distance, watched quietly as she devoured the food with trembling fingers, eyes occasionally darting to him as if expecting him to snatch it back. She didn't chew much, just swallowed. Her body didn't trust the warmth yet, didn't trust this moment. Stu had seen enough starving people in his time to know what survival looked like. And she wasn't savoring anything. She was surviving. When the first meal was gone, he offered another. She took it, slower this time. Still hungry, still wary, but no longer trembling. Only when the third package was empty did she stop. She leaned back against the wall, breathing harder than before, like the act of eating had taken just as much from her as the hunger itself. And then finally, she looked at him. There was something in her expression now that hadn't been there earlier. Not gratitude exactly, but a shift, a flicker of awareness, recognition. He spoke again, slowly this time. "I'm Stu." He pointed to his chest. "Stu." She blinked, then tilted her head slightly. Not in confusion, but in that oddly analytical way he'd seen from engineers and repair techs when they were trying to figure out how something worked. "Stu," she repeated softly, her accent strange and lilting. The way she said it, it didn't sound like mimicry. It sounded like acceptance. He smiled, careful not to overdo it. "And you?" She hesitated. Looked down. Her hand moved toward the thin metal strip sewn into her tattered wrap, what was left of it. Most of it had melted away from exposure, but one part had symbols carved into the surface. She pressed her fingers gently to it. Then she shook her head. "No," she said, voice rasping. "No. Name." He frowned. Not because he didn't understand, but because of the way she said it. "Not I don't remember. Not I won't say, just no name." Stu nodded slowly. "Okay, we'll work on that." He stood and walked to the heating unit, turning up the dial just a little more. The dome groaned softly, vents hissing as warmth spread further into the room. He could feel the contrast growing. Outside, a death storm raged against the walls. Inside, it was calm. Not exactly warm, but bearable. Safe. She watched him move. Closely. Her eyes followed everything. His steps, the way his hands adjusted the controls, the way he moved around obstacles. Not with suspicion, with curiosity. Like she was trying to understand how this world worked, piece by piece. He returned to her with a cup of hot water. It was the closest thing he had to tea. She took it with both hands and held it close, her fingers absorbing the heat with visible relief. She drank slowly this time. The silence between them stretched, but it wasn't empty. It was tentative, careful. Her eyes wandered to the window, where thick layers of frost had blurred the outside world into a pale smudge. She stared for a long moment before speaking again. Cold. No stop. He looked at her. The way she formed the sentence. It was broken, but not random. She understood. "No, it doesn't," he replied. "It doesn't stop." She looked down at the cup again, then back up at him. "You help. Why?" He hesitated. There were rules. There were protocols. There was a long list of reasons why he shouldn't have brought her inside. Why he should have alerted command the moment he saw her. But none of that mattered now. "Because you were dying," he said simply. "And I couldn't just let that happen." She stared at him for a while, then nodded. Once. "Stu," she said again carefully, then pointed at him. "Safe." The word hit him like a punch to the chest. Not because it was wrong, but because it was too right. He cleared his throat and looked away, pretending to check the heater again. "You should rest," he said. "You'll need your strength." She didn't lie down. Instead, she pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders, shifted into the corner of the dome where the heat was strongest, and sat quietly, watching him. Like she'd decided something. Like maybe for now, she was staying. And for the first time in years, Stu felt something stir under the weight of his routine, something small, something quiet, but undeniably there. Hope. She was still a mystery, still an unknown. But in the middle of a frozen moon, with nothing but steel walls and survival between them, they had taken their first step toward something neither of them could name yet. Not safety, not trust, but maybe something close. And that was enough. The storm outside had calmed to a low, guttural moan. Less a scream now, more a long exhale. The worst had passed, though the temperatures remained well below lethal. Stu stood by the dome's main console, tapping through system checks more out of habit than necessity. He kept stealing glances toward the corner of the room, where she sat curled up in the blanket he'd given her. She hadn't spoken again since calling him safe. But something in her posture had shifted. She was no longer braced for the worst. Her shoulders weren't so tense. Her gaze didn't dart from exit to exit anymore. She simply watched him, not with fear, with interest. He ran diagnostics on the perimeter sensors just to keep his hands moving, just to keep from staring too long. Every so often, he caught her eyes on him, and when he did, she didn't look away. Instead, she held his gaze. She was quiet, but not empty. There was a sharpness in her, intelligence, alertness. She was learning, even if she said nothing, watching, absorbing. When he finally powered down the console and turned back to face her, She tilted her head slightly and gestured to the control pad he'd just used. Her voice was hoarse, uncertain. You speak to this? He blinked, surprised by the clarity in her English. Not perfect, but far better than he'd expected. Sort of, he said. I tell it what to do. It usually ignores me. Her brow furrowed. It is a machine? Yeah. Maintenance systems, temperature control, sensors, solar grid, that kind of thing. She nodded slowly, processing the information. Then she looked around the dome again, more deliberate this time. You live alone? He hesitated before answering. Yeah, just me. A long pause. Then softly, why? There it was, the question no one had asked in years, the one he'd never really answered out loud. Stu let out a breath and leaned against the edge of the table. Because sometimes people break, he said, and some of us stay broken longer than others. She didn't respond right away. Instead, she stood, slowly, carefully, still wrapped in the blanket. Her body was steadier now, more controlled. She moved with caution, but not weakness. She stepped toward the heating vent and knelt beside it, extending her hands into the warmth. I break too, she said, not looking at him. Her voice was quiet, and something in the way she said it made Stu's chest tighten. She wasn't trying to explain. She was simply stating it, like a fact, like a truth that needed no defense. He sat down across from her, folding his legs beneath him on the floor. Were you running from something? He asked. She didn't answer. Instead, she looked at the cup in her hands, turned it once, then twice. No home, she said after a moment. No place. There was no self-pity in her tone, just that same factual finality. He nodded slowly. Yeah, I know that feeling. They sat in silence for a while, letting the warmth fill the space between them. Outside, the wind had dropped to a whisper. A thin layer of frost continued to creep down the inner dome, curling like delicate veins across the glass. Eventually, she broke the silence again. You fix things, she said. Stu looked up. I try to. She pointed at the console. And that, you teach me? He blinked. That wasn't what he expected. You want to learn systems maintenance? Her head tilted. Learn this life. He didn't know what to say to that, so he nodded. Sure, I can show you the basics. She smiled, just a little. It was faint, crooked, and so brief it almost didn't register, but it was real. A moment of warmth in a room that had known nothing but cold for far too long. He rose to his feet, walked to the corner storage unit, and pulled out a second pair of thermal gloves. They were worn and too big for her, but she slipped them on without complaint. He walked her through the basics: power routing, vent management, diagnostics. She listened carefully, nodding at each step, her eyes bouncing between the screen and his hands. When he pointed to the wiring schematic, she followed his instructions without hesitation. She learned fast, too fast. He caught her mimicking the exact way he pressed the interface keys, the subtle rhythm he used to avoid sensor lag. She was more than just curious. She was absorbing everything, like she needed to. After 20 minutes, she rerouted the vent output without being told. Stu blinked at the screen. How did you know how to do that? She looked at him, matter of fact. You show. I remember. He laughed, not at her, just in disbelief. Well, he said, grinning, if you're planning to take over the place, I'll need to renegotiate rent. She tilted her head again. Rent? Never mind, he chuckled. The tension between them was changing, shifting. No longer two strangers trapped together by chance. Now they were beginning to orbit the same rhythm. As evening fell, the dome's lights dimmed to conserve power. He prepared 2 more heat meals, and they sat together by the heating unit, sharing food in companionable silence. After they ate, she reached into the torn remains of her wrap and pulled out a small object, smooth, circular, metallic. She held it in her palm and studied it with a strange reverence before offering it to him. He took it gently, turning it in his fingers. It was a chipped identification disc, the kind used in off-world transports, old, scarred. The surface was marked in a language he didn't recognize, but the corrosion told enough of the story. She pointed to it. That was before. Then she tapped her chest softly. Now. Here. And finally she pointed at him. Safe. He didn't respond at first. The weight of that word, safe, meant more than she knew. Or maybe she knew exactly what it meant. Either way, it cracked something open inside him. He looked down at the disc, then back at her. "You still want a name?" he asked. She nodded. "Then we'll find one together." She leaned back, closing her eyes for the first time since she'd eaten. And within minutes, her breathing slowed into sleep. Stu sat beside her in the low light, the disc still in his hand, and stared at the storm-frosted glass overhead. Whatever this was becoming, it wasn't just survival anymore. It was something more. And he wasn't ready for it. But maybe that was okay. Maybe they didn't need to be ready. Maybe they just needed to begin. Kestra 6 hadn't seen sunlight in 3 days. Stu stood near the dome's fogged-up window, a half-full mug of reheated caffeine paste warming his palms as the storm winds coiled and twisted just beyond the glass. The outside world was a blur, pale snow and silver ice blending into a single, endless white. Somewhere beyond the ridgelines, the last of the storm cells was breaking apart, leaving only silence in its wake. Behind him, the dome had grown quieter too. She slept more now, but it wasn't the restless, fevered unconsciousness of when she'd first arrived. It was real sleep, deep, uninterrupted, healing. Stu found himself listening for her breathing at night, not out of fear, but something else, something that felt both foreign and familiar. Responsibility. She hadn't shared her name, hadn't revealed anything about where she came from or how she ended up half dead outside his airlock. And yet, she was here, sharing space, sharing silence. And now, as of yesterday, learning. She was already better at rerouting heating conduits than half the techs he'd worked with on Prometheus Station. He glanced over at her. She was still asleep, curled in the blanket she refused to part with, one hand tucked beneath her cheek, the other loosely resting over the broken identification disc she always kept near. Even in sleep, her fingers brushed it like a talisman. Whatever it meant, it mattered more than she let on. Stu turned back to the window. He didn't realize he was gripping the mug too tightly until the plastic creaked in his hands. The dome was warm now, but a chill still lived under his skin. He hadn't told her about Iris. He hadn't told anyone in years. Not that there was anyone left to tell. 3 years ago, just before taking this post, he'd been stationed on Marnus 4, working a comms relay hub in low orbit. Routine diagnostics, empty corridors, a good place for a man trying to forget. Iris had been a civilian, non-essential personnel. She worked in food systems, of all things. Bright, funny, relentlessly kind, and entirely unprepared for the kind of cruelty bureaucracy could justify. When a containment breach had triggered emergency lockdowns, he had been on the other side of the pressure doors. They told him later it was protocol. Only essential staff were given priority for evac. Iris hadn't made the list. No warning, no goodbye, just silence. Stu had taken the Kestris assignment the same week. Voluntary isolation, they called it. But really, he just wanted a place where no one could ask questions. A place quiet enough to bury everything that still haunted him. And now, here she was. This strange woman from nowhere, wrapped in mystery and frost, sleeping like she belonged here. He didn't know what to do with that. She stirred. His eyes flicked toward her just as she sat up slowly, blinking against the low light. Her white hair clung to her cheek. For a moment, her expression was guarded, uncertain. Then she saw him. Her shoulders relaxed. "You're up early," he said softly. She rubbed at her eyes, then nodded. "Dreams," she said. Her accent still bent the words slightly, but her vocabulary had grown. Not real ones, just loud ones. He walked over and handed her the mug. She accepted it with a grateful nod. "Nightmares?" She considered, then shook her head. "Not fear, just noise, places I do not know, faces I don't remember." Stu sat on the floor beside her, not too close, just enough to share warmth. "You talk in your sleep," he said. She looked over sharply. "Did I say things?" He shrugged. "Not in English, but you kept repeating something. Same word, I think." She stared down at the mug. Her fingers tightened around it. "I can't remember what it means," she whispered. "I think it was my name, before." He didn't push. Not yet. Instead, he leaned back against the curved wall of the dome and closed his eyes for a moment. "You ever wonder if forgetting is easier?" She looked at him, studying his face. "You forget someone?" He didn't answer for a long time. Then finally, "I tried. Doesn't work." "What happened?" His jaw tightened. For a second, he almost said nothing, but something about her voice, the lack of judgment in it, cut through the silence like light through fog. She was someone I loved, he said. She died because someone in a tower thought she didn't matter. The woman nodded once. That happens. He blinked at her. That happens? Her gaze was distant. Where I'm from, we were ranked, born with number. Worth came after, sometimes never. Stu felt his stomach twist. So what? They just left you behind? She was quiet for a moment. Then she looked at him. They didn't leave me. I ran. That was new. That was something. He opened his mouth to ask more, but she cut in first. You said name. Still no? Stu tilted his head. Still haven't thought of one? She shook her head. Hard to choose. Feels like stealing. Then maybe it chooses you, he offered. She gave him a curious look. That's not how names work. Sure it is. Sometimes the right one finds you when you're not looking. She didn't laugh, but her lips twitched, and her head tilted again. He was beginning to understand that meant she was amused. I learned more words today, she asked. You want to? She nodded firmly. This place, these things, all yours. I should understand them. He stood, offered her a hand. Then come on. Time to teach you how to keep the lights on when the generator acts like it wants to die. She took his hand. The contact was brief, practical, but he felt it. Warm, steady, real. They spent the morning rewiring the solar relay backups. She asked questions constantly about voltage, conduits, why the cables were color-coded the way they were. She wasn't just memorizing. She was adapting, thinking in systems, not just steps. He'd seen engineers with years of training who didn't think that way. Around midday, a warning light flickered on the far console. External motion sensor, south field. Stu froze. The signal blinked once, then vanished. She noticed his shift immediately. What is it? Probably just snowdrift, he lied. But he moved to the console anyway, checking the readout. The data was inconclusive. One spike, no follow-up. But it wasn't wind. The signature was wrong. She stepped beside him, reading over his shoulder. Someone come? I don't know, he said. But we'll shut the outer cams down for a while. If it was a drone, I don't want them seeing anything they shouldn't. She nodded. Will they come for me? Stu didn't answer, because deep down he was starting to realize the truth. Someone already was. And next time, they might not just walk away. He turned off the screen. We'll be ready, he said quietly, no matter what. And for the first time since Iris, he meant it. It started with a question. Not one she asked aloud, but something in the way she watched him that morning. Head tilted slightly, eyes narrowed in thought, like she was trying to match sounds with meaning faster than even she could explain. Stu was mid-sentence, talking her through the waste vent's pressure gauge, when she abruptly finished his sentence for him. And if PSI levels exceed 6.5, backup intake closes, she said. He blinked. Yeah, that's exactly right. She turned to look at him, her face unreadable. You think I should not know that yet? He hesitated. The answer was yes. She had only been here a few days. Even with her sharp memory and constant focus, some of the terms she used, complex, specific engineering terminology, weren't things she could have simply picked up by watching him. And her pronunciation was cleaner now, still accented but smoother, less hesitant. It wasn't just learning anymore. It was accelerated comprehension, fluidity. Something about it had been bugging him for the last 48 hours, but he hadn't wanted to ask. Now he couldn't ignore it. You're learning really fast, he said slowly. Like, really fast. You knew things yesterday you hadn't even heard me say. She didn't answer, just looked away. He watched her as she crouched down to adjust the panel they'd been working on. Her long white hair had been tied loosely at the back with a strip of fabric. Her pale blue skin glowed faintly in the filtered light of the dome. She didn't look fragile anymore, just quiet, careful. You're using something, aren't you? He asked. Something's helping you understand me. Her hands stilled on the console, silence stretched. Then, without turning around, she reached into the wrap she always kept near her, the one she'd worn the night he found her, and pulled out a small object. She held it up in one hand, a circular metal disc, no bigger than Stu's palm. Smooth edges, scorched in places. Cracks ran across one side where the internal panel had partially melted. The faintest pulse of red light still flickered at its core. Stu took it gently when she offered it, handling it like a relic. What is this? He murmured. Cognition weave, she said. Old, damaged, still works? A little. He turned it over in his hands. Like a translator? Yes, not for speech, for patterns, sounds, emotion, connection. It makes bridges. Inside. Stu whistled under his breath. No wonder you're picking up English like it's second nature. She nodded. I don't remember my words. Mine, I lost too much. But your words, they grow fast in me. He gave her a slow look. So this thing is helping you think in English? Yes, she said. Then after a beat, added quietly, but not only because of this. I want to understand. That helps too. There was a long pause. She looked down at her hands, flexed her fingers as if feeling something far away. We used them, the ones like me, to travel, to blend, when we were sent to other places, to watch or to listen. You were sent somewhere? Stu asked gently. She didn't answer, but her silence said enough. He turned the disc over once more, inspecting the circuitry. This thing is advanced. I haven't seen tech like this in decades. It is not mine, she said. Was given. Long ago. He handed it back, and she took it with both hands, holding it close, not as a tool, but like a piece of herself. It was the only thing she'd kept from her life before, the only thing she'd risked her life to protect when she crossed the frozen hellscape of Kestra 6, and now she had chosen to share it with him. Not because he asked, because she trusted him. She slipped the disc into the hidden pocket in her wrap again and stood. I learned because I must, she said. I have no home. I have no name. But if I can speak your words, then maybe I can stay here. Be something new. Stu felt something shift in his chest, an old familiar pressure. He stood beside her. You already are. She met his eyes. This close, he could see the gold flecks in her irises, the way they seemed to shift like liquid when the light hit them just right. You said sometimes the name finds you, she said. Maybe that is soon. I think it's close, he replied. And when it does, we'll make it yours. Together. That afternoon, she helped him recalibrate the solar relays. The wind had died down, and for the first time since she'd arrived, they opened the outer hatch briefly, just enough to clear the snow buildup on the intake valves. She didn't flinch at the cold anymore, didn't hide behind him. She moved with him, watched his back, worked as his equal. Inside, they shared a quiet meal. She corrected his word for a component she'd misheard 2 days ago, and he laughed, not at her, but because it was the kind of thing someone did when they were settled. Like she had roots here now, even if they were just starting to grow. Later, as he prepared to run diagnostics one last time before powering down for the night, the comms panel flickered, just for a moment. A static pulse, a ghost signal, too brief to trace, but unmistakably intentional. He didn't say anything. Not yet. She was already asleep, her back curled toward the vent, one hand resting over the disc again. He stared at the panel for a long moment, then tapped the screen and shut it off. They weren't alone anymore, and whoever was out there might already be looking for her. He looked back at her sleeping form. Not tonight. Tonight she was safe, and for now, that was enough. The dome was quiet that evening. Stu sat beside the heating vent, legs stretched out, his back resting against the curved wall. The air was warm, scented faintly with the last of the ration stew they'd shared. Outside, the winds had died down to a whisper, brushing snow against the outer shell like sand over glass. She was sitting nearby, the blanket draped over her shoulders, but she wasn't looking at him. Her eyes were fixed on the frosted window. The reflection of the internal light played across her face, catching in her pale lashes, softening the sharp lines of her jaw. There was something distant in her expression. Not fear, not sadness, just a weight she'd been carrying too long. I used to watch stars, she said, so quietly he barely caught it. He glanced toward her but didn't speak. He let the silence hang, giving her space. In the beginning, she continued, we didn't go to new worlds to live. Only to learn. Observe. Rickard Stu didn't move, didn't interrupt. I was bred for that, she said. Not born, grown, selected. Intelligence, obedience, retention, no emotions, no attachments, just function. Her voice stayed calm, but he could hear the fracture lines beneath it. We weren't allowed names, only identifiers. I was C5A, Cohort 5, Assembly Class. He breathed in slowly. You never had a choice. number. But we were told we were lucky, elevated, valuable. Our minds were connected to central learning streams from an early stage. We processed languages before we ever spoke aloud. That explained how quickly she'd adapted here. The comprehension, the mimicry, the intuition. But they made a mistake, she said, her fingers curling into the fabric on her lap. They sent me to observe humans. Now she turned to look at him. You weren't like us. Messy, loud, illogical, but warm, so warm. You touched everything. You spoke with feeling. You cried, you laughed. I couldn't stop watching. She looked down at her hands. I started feeling things, curiosity, then guilt, then longing. I couldn't hide it well enough. They saw it in my reports. I was recalled for deconstruction. Stu felt his chest tighten. You mean, they called it reassignment, she said coldly. But it meant deletion, a memory wipe, a reset. The mind I am now, erased and reassembled. She took a slow, shaky breath. I escaped. It wasn't heroic, it was desperate. I damaged a transport module before it launched, climbed inside its maintenance crawl space, hid during launch. I don't know how many days passed. There was no food, no control. It crashed here, hard. Her voice cracked slightly. I walked through snow for, I don't know, I had no orientation, no signal. I followed heat trails. I thought I'd die in the cold. Part of me wanted to. Stu stared at her, not in shock, but in awe, of her will to survive, of the unimaginable distance she'd come, both physically and emotionally. She looked up at him again. And then, your door opened. The quiet that followed wasn't empty. He moved closer, slowly, cautiously. He reached out and this time placed his hand on top of hers, no hesitation. Her fingers tensed beneath his, but she didn't pull away. She looked down at their hands, then up at him. Her voice was barely a whisper. No one's ever touched me without claiming something. Stu's thumb moved gently across her knuckles. I'm not here to claim anything. I just want you to know you're not alone. She blinked fast, as if fighting something behind her eyes. When I was growing, I thought feelings were design flaws. I was told that love was a human illness, that it made systems inefficient, fragile. He gave a small, tired smile. We are fragile, but we're also strong in ways they'll never understand. Her fingers turned beneath his hand, just slightly, until their palms touched. It was the first time she initiated contact, not from panic, not from necessity, just choice. I don't know what I am now, she said, not a watcher, not part of them, not fully yours, not yet. You don't have to know, he replied. Not today, you're still here. That's enough. She nodded and her voice came quieter now. But I think I want to be something, human. He didn't say anything. He just stayed there with her, hand in hers, heat between them as the snow drifted softly outside. The dome, once just a shelter, once a cage of silence, felt different now. Not just safe, alive. When she finally leaned her head against his shoulder, it wasn't to hide or seek comfort. It was because she belonged there. And for the first time since she had fallen out of the sky, she allowed herself to believe it. So did he. The old satellite station groaned quietly around them, wind pressing against its outer hull like a living thing trying to find its way in. Snow drifted across the sealed entrance, muffling sound and turning the world outside into a frozen dream. But inside, buried beneath metal and time, warmth flickered in faint pulses, soft lights, recycled air, the slow hum of restored power cells. Stu sat on the floor beside the central console, his back against a support beam, watching the monitor flicker with diagnostic updates. Across from him, Asha stood over a crate of salvaged tools, her posture steady, her presence somehow heavier than usual, like she'd grown more solid in the last few hours, more real. They hadn't spoken much since arriving at the wreck, but it wasn't an awkward silence. It was intentional. They were both listening, to the quiet, to each other, to the thoughts they hadn't voiced yet. The last signal had been close, too close. They knew it wouldn't be long before something, arrived. Stu leaned forward and adjusted the monitor. The passive scans showed a vessel still in low orbit, circling like a hawk that had lost its prey, but wasn't ready to stop hunting. He sighed. They're not giving up. Asha didn't look over. Numbered, they won't. You said they'd expect you to run. I did, she replied calmly, but not anymore. She picked up a fusion torch, tested its weight in her hand, and set it aside. You've changed your mind, Stu said, not as a question. I've changed, she said, turning to face him. I was a shadow, a reflection of what they made me. Even when I escaped, I was still shaped by their rules, their silence, their fear. She crossed the room slowly and knelt beside him, her knees brushing his. But here, with you, I've begun to understand what it means to be more than function, more than useful. I can choose now. For the first time, I can stay. Stu studied her face. Those eyes, once so guarded, now wide open, clear, fierce. Asha, he said quietly, that name you gave yourself, do you know what it means to me? She tilted her head. It's not just a word, he continued. It's not just hope. It's the moment you stopped running and started living. Asha's hand found his, fingers folding into his with the kind of certainty that comes not from desperation, but from conviction. I want to rebuild, she said. He blinked. The dome? More than that, a life. One that belongs to us, not to them. Stu felt something shift deep in his chest. Something old. Something long buried beneath years of frost and silence. He nodded. Then we go back. She smiled, faint and full of quiet fire. Together, she said. Before he could respond, the monitor chimed. A sharp tone that didn't belong to passive scans. He turned back to the console, eyes narrowing as new data spilled across the screen. Low orbit drop detected. Subsurface disturbance 1 click east. Not a full ship. A drone, scouting. Asha stepped in close behind him, reading the data over his shoulder. They're testing, she murmured. Mapping the terrain. Looking for heat, energy spikes, anything. Stu's jaw clenched. We powered down everything. They'll find nothing, she said. But they'll keep narrowing in. He turned to her. We need to do more than hide. Asha was already moving. Then we distract them. He stood, grabbing his jacket. How? I can trigger the old comm relay station, from a distance. Just enough power to mimic a heat signature. It'll draw them off course. That's risky. You'll have to cross open snow. I've done it before. He stepped in front of her, blocking her path. Not alone. Her expression softened. You don't need to protect me. I'm not, he said. I'm choosing to. Their eyes held for a long moment. Then she nodded. Together, they gathered what they needed. A power cell rigged with a delay switch, a decoy transponder, minimal gear. As they climbed up through the station's emergency hatch, the wind hit them like a wave, cold and sharp, slicing through their clothes and stinging their cheeks. The world above was a silver-blue expanse of untouched ice. Still, silent, waiting. The two of them moved like ghosts across the snow. Asha led the way, navigating by memory, by instinct. Stu kept pace, watching the skies, feeling the weight of everything pressing down from orbit. After half an hour, they reached the ridge overlooking the collapsed relay tower. Asha crouched and opened the casing of the transponder. Her fingers worked fast, graceful even in the biting wind. Stu watched her, not the machine but her, realizing that no part of her was who she used to be. Not an observer, not a number, just Asha. She powered the unit, set the timer, then covered it with snow. It'll go off in 10 minutes, she said. They'll think it's an engine warming up. Let's get back, Stu said, offering his hand. She took it. They ran. By the time they reached the station again, the wind had picked up, but the warmth inside felt earned, real. The monitor blinked once as the decoy activated. Ping. Then again. Ping. Then nothing. Stu let out a breath and slumped against the wall. They bought it, he said. For now, Asha replied. He turned to her. Then let's not waste it. Later that night, as they lay side by side on the floor, wrapped in blankets, listening to the wind scratch against the walls, Asha whispered, "This isn't the end, is it?" "No," Stu said. "It's the beginning." She reached over and took his hand again. "I'm not afraid of them anymore." "Good," he whispered, "because they're afraid of what you've become." She smiled against his shoulder, her eyes slowly closing. In the shelter of ruins beneath the snow and silence, two survivors made a choice. Not to run, not to disappear, but to live. Together. And that made all the difference. The morning broke slow over Kestra 6, a pale light creeping across the horizon like it was still deciding whether the world below deserved warmth. Snow glittered outside the half-buried satellite station, the ice plains painted in soft blues and dull silver. The storm had passed, the sky, so often brutal, hung unusually still. Inside, the shelter was quiet. Asha stood by the entrance hatch, her silhouette bathed in the blue glow of the backup generator. She wasn't armored. She wasn't hiding. Her pale skin shimmered faintly in the cold light. White hair pulled back, eyes calm as she watched the wind pass over the dunes outside. Stu watched her from behind, standing a few paces away, arms crossed, heart hammering in his chest. Not from fear, but from everything he wanted to say, but hadn't. Not yet. He took a step toward her. She didn't turn, but her voice reached him like it had been waiting. They didn't find us. No, he said softly. They didn't. They will come again. Maybe, he said, but they won't take you. She turned now slowly, eyes meeting his. They took everything else. Her voice wasn't bitter, just true, like she was naming something she no longer feared. But they didn't take you, he said, stepping closer. And they never will. Asha searched his face for something. Not reassurance, not promises, but proof. Something real. And if they do? She asked. Stu was inches from her now, the faint hum of the heater behind him, her breath mingling with his in the cold air between them. Then I'll fight, he said, for you. She blinked, slowly, then nodded once as if some inner tension had finally loosened. I believe you, she whispered. Silence stretched between them, charged, waiting. Then she spoke again, voice lower, a little uneven. You know, I've seen mating rituals on 3 separate human colonies. I studied emotional bonding behavior, analyzed hundreds of variables, proximity, vocal changes, eye contact. He raised an eyebrow. Sounds romantic. She tilted her head. It was efficient. He laughed, soft and real. But none of it, she added quietly, none of it told me what this feels like. She reached up slowly and placed her hand flat over his chest, just above his heart. It's loud, she said. He covered her hand with his. Yeah, he said. It gets louder when you're near. Their eyes locked, and then she leaned in, close, deliberate, certain, and kissed him. It wasn't perfect. It was hesitant at first, a little unsure, but it deepened with every second, with every breath. Her lips were cold, but her touch was warm. And when he kissed her back, she sighed into him, like something long buried had finally been given permission to rise. When they broke apart, their foreheads touched. Her eyes were closed. So were his. Neither of them moved for a long time, and then in a voice barely louder than the wind outside, she said the words, I love you. His eyes opened, not with shock, but with recognition. He pulled back just enough to see her face. I love you too, he said. Since the moment you called me safe, she smiled. The kind of smile that made time feel irrelevant. I didn't understand the word then, she said. You didn't need to, he replied. You felt it. She nodded slowly, still touching his chest. I think I knew, from the first time you didn't ask who I was. They sat together after that, side by side on the floor, knees drawn up, hands still linked. The world outside continued its frozen turning, uncaring and unchanging. But inside the shelter, everything had shifted. That evening, they gathered what remained of their supplies, packed tools and modules into insulated packs, and left behind the cold shell that had kept them hidden. The sky was clear, a deep, endless gradient of twilight blues. No ships, no signals, just quiet. They walked across the snowfields, stepping over long drifted scars in the ice, toward the dome, their dome, half buried in frost but still standing. Stu stopped halfway and looked over at her. We don't have to go back. Asha stared at the horizon. We do, she said. Why? She turned toward him, her eyes clear and sure. Because love doesn't hide, it builds. He nodded, and they walked the rest of the way together. The dome groaned as the entrance hatch opened for the first time in weeks. Air rushed out, dry and cold. Inside, dust had settled on every surface. But beneath it all, the systems hummed, low and steady, alive. They worked late into the night, side by side, reconnecting power, rewriting access codes, rerouting energy, no longer rebuilding something old, but making it theirs. When the lights came back on, Asha stepped forward and pulled something from her pack. It was the small nameplate Stu had given her, polycarbonate, scorched on one edge. She had etched a second name below her own, Asha plus Stu Dome 1, family unit. He laughed quietly as she placed it near the console. That's official now, huh? She looked over her shoulder. Do humans usually seal their bonds with kisses or with signing paperwork? Kisses are better, he said, walking toward her. He kissed her again. Longer this time. Slower. Nothing rushed. Just the pure, steady presence of now. They made their home that night, not in ceremony, but in choice. In the warmth of shared breath and blankets, in laughter over burned rations and cracked heating coils, in whispered plans for a garden that might never grow, but would be planted anyway. When they lay together, tangled and tired and full, Stu brushed his thumb across her cheek. "What does it feel like?" he asked. She blinked, smiling softly. "Like I'm real." "You are," he whispered. "You make me real," she whispered back. "No," he said, kissing her forehead. "You saved yourself. I just opened the door." They fell asleep like that, wrapped around each other, safe in the place they had made. And as Kestra 6 turned once more beneath a silent sky, nothing marked the moment but a dome in the snow and a name carved into plastic. But for them, that was everything. Because now, they weren't running. They weren't hiding. They were home. The end.